The largest and most advanced economy in East and Central Africa has seen its inflation rate rise yet again. Kenya's year-on-year inflation rate inched up to 6.57% in August from a revised 6.55% the previous month. Essentially, inflation is the rise in prices you'll pay for goods and services. You'll have to spend more to get the same things. This means that right now, Kenyans are paying more for purchasing the basics. Inflation erodes the average person's purchasing power. Everyone's true inflation rate is different because we all buy different products and services. Now, in May of 2021, the year-on-year inflation rate in Kenya increased to 5.87%, the third highest level at that time seen since April 2020. The expansion was related to higher prices of food items such as white bread and cabbage. In April of 2021, the rate was at 5.76%. The lowest inflation rates were registered between June and October of 2020, and those remained below 5%. Kenya's inflation rate has been rising since January, while there was a slight dip for the figure for April. And there are more possible increases on the horizon that will soon hit Kenyans in their wallets starting October 1st. What's pushing the rise in inflation for Kenya? What impact will this have on the economy? Today, we're looking at Kenya's latest inflation data. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Now joining me from Nairobi, Kenya is Gichinga, Chief Economist at Mentria Economics. Ken is, of course, a regular here on Business Edge, and we're great to have him. We're very happy to have him back. Ken, welcome once again. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tolulope.
So let's look at this inflation figure. I know it's quite enviable for maybe an economy like Nigeria that's in the double digits, but Kenya is not alone in being a very strong economy that's in single-digit inflation rates. And they've managed to maintain this single-digit inflation figure for quite a while now. And despite the effects of the pandemic and the attendant economic lockdown, how has East Africa's largest economy stayed with single-digit inflation for so long?
Many thanks. Indeed, the central bank has pursued what is called inflation targeting for the last several years. And they've tried to use the levers of monetary policy to be able to keep it at an upper limit of 7.5% and at a lower limit of 2.5%. But the ideal target has been 5%. And the way they do that is by really controlling how much money is in circulation.
So the most recent data released by the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, the increase between July, which was 6.55%, and August, which was 6.57%, is just about 0.02%. It's quite marginal in many estimations. Is this something to actually be concerned about, or is it just this microeconomic play that's happening? It's just the small movements. Should we really be worried for Kenya regarding this?
Well, there is a bit of concern because there are two types of inflation. There's what you call demand pull inflation, and this is really a sign of prosperity. This is people with more money and therefore more money circulating in the economy and prices going up. But there's also what is called cost push inflation, and this is really the cost of supplies going up, cost of food, cost of oil, and that is a negative type of inflation, and that's what we are facing in Kenya. So it is a cause of concern because it's a cost push. It's very hard for central banks to control cost push inflation because they can't control the price of oil or the price of imported food. So from that perspective, it's something that needs to be thought about from a much broader perspective.
Okay, so you're talking about this being something that the Central Bank of Kenya is looking at because they can't affect some level of control on it. In terms of how this impacts the average Kenyan in the shillings in their pocket, what's the impact we're going to see from July to August and how prices may have changed for them?
Well, for the ordinary Kenyan, it just means they'll have to part with more money at the supermarket for the same amount of goods, whether it's food, whether it's fuel at the pump, or whether it's transport, really, on the public transport. So it really means because wages have remained stagnant for many years, whether you're in the civil service or in many parts of the private sector, there are segments where salaries have not changed for quite a number of years. So that is being eroded in that perspective.
So we've talked now about the control that the Central Bank of Kenya may try to exert, but then certain things like the imported items that they can't control. And this is all about market forces. So this particular rise that we've seen from July to August, and even going back further to June as well, that dip was just in April. What are the factors that are leading to this particular increase? Are they all imported factors, we might say, even though the increase in the cost of fuel also came in August, and that was a decision made by the government?
Well, there are plenty of factors that come into play. Obviously, the food part plays a big role in the sense that we've been importing quite a bit. But even on things such as the exchange rate, the shilling has been weakening against the dollar. I think right now we are almost approaching 109, 110. So it means even the cost of importation, just for the same amount of goods with a weaker currency, means your prices go up, and that is called imported inflation. So obviously the solution has to really be around, particularly on food, how can we grow more domestically so that we can reduce our import bill? And we have things such as wheat, which we import a lot from the States, which can grow in Kenya. So I think a big part of it has to be with the Agriculture Ministry in terms of how do we cultivate more locally to prevent all this importation.
Okay, let's talk about the central bank a bit more. Reading up on this, it's very obvious that many central banks around the world view stable and low inflation as a very important thing, something that they actively work for. And on the website, the Central Bank of Kenya said that it is responsible for formulating monetary policy to achieve and maintain price stability. The CBK also recently, they had a survey, and that was conducted by them, and they found that a majority of company chief executives in Kenya believe that rising inflation will negatively affect the performance of their firms in the current quarter as higher prices of goods cut demand. The survey found that most business executives in 11 sectors of the economy projected mixed demand in orders in the third quarter, pointing to the negative effects of higher prices that saw inflation rise. Is the CBK currently planning any interventions concerning the inflation rate, or right now they're watching and waiting to see if the trend continues or if the number rises?
Well, the tools they have in place are interest rates, and they can be able to control interest rates, and that's how they control how much money is in the banking sector. But what I've said and written before is when you think of Kenya and many developing countries, a lot more money is moving through mobile money than through the banking system. And in that case, to the extent that you can control inflation through bank interest rates is quite minimal. So that's a powerful point. The role of mobile money is a critical thing. In fact, I've argued that the tariffs that you charge on mobile money has a greater impact in terms of affecting how much money is moving around. And we saw that last year during the COVID pandemic when they waived the tariffs for transferring money below 1,000 shillings. We saw a lot more money moving through the system. So I think we need to think of monetary policy from an African perspective, and I think that's what has been lacking. We've been approaching it from a European perspective.
And it's interesting you mentioned this because I know that Kenya has been in conversation with the Bretton Woods institution, the IMF and the World Bank, and there's been conversation around increase in wages for civil service workers. There's been back and forth on that and the places where the IMF wants Kenya to cut certain things. When you look at this inflation rate and you look at some of these ongoing conversations, where do you think the compromise might be? How much room can Kenya give in regards to what people like the IMF and the World Bank are telling them about the economy?
Well, I think we have to look at it from a broad perspective. Indeed, where the Bretton Woods institutions are coming from is they're saying Kenya has to reduce its wage bill because it's too high. But if you really think about it, I've always said our public sector spending to GDP is quite low. It's about 25% of GDP. So to the extent that you can reduce or maintain salaries at that level, it becomes very hard. If you look at what a typical policeman earns, a typical teacher earns, it's not very much. So to the extent that you can be able to keep that low when the cost of living is going high, I think what it does, it first creates a social disorder. It even contributes to things like corruption Because for this policeman, you're trying to live on a very tight budget when the cost of living is going up. So even you become very vulnerable to corruption. And I think sometimes that's the broader perspective that sometimes policymakers lack. How do people supplement their salaries when the cost of living is going up? And unfortunately, you'll find corruption has become one of those avenues. So I think we need to rethink the whole austerity measure. We need to make sure essential services are well compensated so that service delivery can continue.
All right, Ken, just hold the line, as we would say. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we look at the fact that there may be more expenses, more increases coming for Kenyans October the 1st, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how that concerns the Kenya Revenue Authority. But new data coming in from Kenya, inflation has gone up by a marginal 0.02%. Some concern, maybe not so much, but there are more things that will concern Kenyans right after this break. And still with me on Business Edge is the Chief Economist, Mentria Economics, Ken Gichinga. And we're looking at the latest data released by the Statistics Bureau in Kenya at the inflation rate that has increased again for August. But Ken, I want us to expand the conversation now, and let's look at some of the things that have increased in price in recent time for Kenyans. The cost of fuel was increased in August. Then, of course, when you add the cost of all the other things we talked about, white bread, cabbage, even basics such as sugar and things like that, what impact have we really seen, particularly with the increase in the cost of fuel, even though government has also been subsidizing it to some point? So where's the subsidy? Where's the increase? How has all of this impacted Kenyans?
Well, I think it's time we take this conversation a bit deeper. And what I had mentioned earlier was inflation going up is a reflection of what is called the Consumer Price Index, where they look at a basket of goods and they say in a typical month, so-and-so consumes this amount of spinach, of bread, of rye, of fuel, and they come up with sort of an average. The problem with that is it assumes that people consume the same things every year, and that's not the case. In fact, in economics, you have something called the substitution effect that says when people find more expensive things, they look for cheaper alternatives. So if, for example, your cost of
Hello, Ken. All right, I think we've just lost communication with Ken Gichinga there, but I'm very sure we'll get him back. And looking at the new inflation data that was released for Kenya, we have the numbers there. It went up just about 0.02%. And some might say that's such a marginal figure, and it gets into the microeconomics of things, but it is a figure that might still concern some. Kenya has been one of the economies on the continent that has managed to maintain a single-digit inflation rate, a plus to them. Now coming up to be, I believe, the third largest economy in sub-Saharan Africa, with Kenya being the largest economy in East and Central Africa. Also want to get into place with the conversation around the increase in excise duty that's meant to kick off in October, actually kicking off October the 1st. There are a number of people who have made some statements against this. And of course, there's also political conversation around that, with the KRA having to now get parliamentary approval for the excise duty to be increased. We'll take a quick break right now. When we see, hopefully we can get Ken back and we'll be wrapping up the conversation. All right, so we've managed to get Ken Gichinga on the phone line so we can continue this conversation. Ken, right before we had to take that break, we were looking at the cost of fuel that was increased in August for Kenyans, even though, as I said earlier, there was a subsidy in play. And you were talking about the mix of factors that we should be looking at. Let's pick up the conversation from there.
Yes, indeed. So I think it's important to understand how inflation is computed. Typically, most countries use what is called a consumer price index. They look at the typical consumption of a normal citizen in terms of food, in terms of fuel, in terms of rent. The problem with that is it assumes that people consume the same things every year, which is not the case. People tend to try different things. People always to find cheaper alternatives. So to the extent that that number reflects the accurate cost of living, I think that can be contested. And I think sometimes you have to think of it from a more broader perspective.
All right, so something else I found interesting, that even with this rise in inflation, increase in fuel prices, the Kenya Revenue Authority is still planning to increase excise duty. So in August, it was announced that the prices of at least 31 goods, including beer, fuel, bottled water, and juice, would increase from October the 1st after the KRA moved to effect annual inflation tax adjustments on excise duty charged on the products. Now, the excise duty on these products will increase almost 5%, 4.97%, in line with average annual inflation. So this is also where politics comes into this. The KRA will, for the first time, have to get parliamentary approval to affect the new rates. We've heard from the Kenya Association of Manufacturers, which has urged the KRA to pause implementation of the annual inflation adjustment tax, and also said that this is because of the economic hardships as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. We also know, as I said earlier, that fuel subsidy is in play. Parliament had overruled the push to have the KRA review the prices every 2 or 3 years in order to cushion consumers and firms from the rising product costs. So when Parliament meets on this, what do you think the outcome will be? Will they approve this increase in excise duty that's coming from the KRA?
Well, I think Parliament is between a rock and a hard place. Obviously, they are the representative of Kenyans, and they do see how Kenyans are suffering in terms of cost of living. That said, they do understand that the government is deep in debt and needs to service that debt and needs to collect enough revenue to service that debt. So I think they'll try to find a middle ground of sorts, where they'll say, for some goods, maybe let's not apply this, but for others, let's apply it. But it's still a bit unfair because the government has applied a salary freeze to most civil servants, so their wages are going to remain constant for the foreseeable future, but they still have to contend with higher taxation. So I think it's that asymmetry that will end up creating that tension within the communities.
And interestingly enough, manufacturers, who many people are assuming will simply just pass the increase down to consumers, they've said that they actually oppose the annual inflation adjustment, arguing that it leads to price instability and distorts the overall inflation. We've heard from soft drink giant Coca-Cola, which actually petitioned Parliament to have the review in tandem with the average annual inflation done every 3 years. Beer maker East Africa Breweries Limited also unsuccessfully lobbied lawmakers to have the price reviews done every 2 years. So when we look at the timing, regardless of the conversation around how it may affect people, let's sort of separate that. Is 1 year too often, or is it right on the mark? Is it a 2-year conversation that should be had? Is it a 3-year conversation? And then bringing in what context should this adjustment even be? Is the conversation around the adjustment, what context should it be?
Well, when you look at investors who come into Kenya and in other African countries, the one thing that they look for is tax price stability, because you want to be able to model your profitability over the next 7 years. So if every year that number is being changed, obviously it makes it very difficult to make business decisions. And you are right, manufacturers end up passing these costs to the consumers. If you take, like, for example, what's happening in the beer market, when these taxes are added on, consumers end up it's actually very toxic to their health. So there's also that social issue of people now, because of the cost of products being very high, looking for cheaper substitutes, which end up harming their health and sometimes even loss of life.
All right, Ken, before I let you go, very quickly, do you have a projection for the next rating? Are we going to still see an upward movement for Kenya's inflation rate, even if it's a marginal one? Do you think there'll be some stability or the potential of a decrease?
Well, I think a lot of that will depend on how the exchange rate behaves. Right now, it's been weakening, and if it continues to weaken further, it means we'll have what is called imported inflation, either through fuel or through food. So that could, to an extent, make inflation start approaching 7%.
Wow. All right. Approaching the upper band that the Central Bank of Kenya has set. Ken Gichinga, thank you so much for joining me on Business Edge. We look forward to having you back.
Thank you very much.
All right. And the conversation continues. There's a lot of conversation happening across the continent now regarding inflation, MPC meetings, and all of those decisions that affect the bottom line and affect the rand, the naira, the Namibian dollar, anything, the shilling as well that may be in our pocket. So we'll be bringing you all the updates as these conversations are happening across the continent. The updates we have for you right after the break are a few stories we're keeping our eyes on. NC4 to watch is next. Our first stop for NC4 to watch is Zambia, where the central bank has kept its benchmark interest rate unchanged, with inflation seen decreasing faster than earlier expected. The Monetary Policy Committee held the rate at 8.5%. This was the first MPC's first rate decision under a new government following elections last month that brought in Hakainde Hichilema. Cote d'Ivoire has reported a major discovery of oil and natural gas offshore by Italian firm ENI. Energy Minister Thomas Camara said the find is estimated to be between 1.5 and 2 billion barrels of oil and around 1.8 to 2.4 trillion cubic feet of gas. And third on the list, the three operating low-cost airlines in South Africa, FlySafair, Air, Kulula, and Lyft, have all launched business class or premium offerings in an effort to compete against South Africa Airways, or rather Airlines, SAA. Now, SAA plans to resume flights on September 23rd, while full-service domestic rival British Airways restarted operations on September the 1st. And finally, central banks in South Africa, Australia, Singapore, and Malaysia have announced that they will conduct a cross-border payments trial using different central bank digital currencies to assess if these allows transactions to be settled more cheaply and easily. Many governments and apex banks around the world are exploring the use of CBDCs, which are digital forms of existing currencies. Nigeria is also floating one by October the 1st. And that's all we have for you. Don't forget to follow us on social media at News Central TV. We are live on our YouTube channel and live on Star Times, Avo TV, as well as Free TV. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. I'll see you next time.